1954 in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. My family has been in Sheboygan since 1904, when my great-grandfather came over from Europe. My mother still lives there in the house that we moved into in 1966. Growing up in a small community, I guess the message for a Jewish kid, at least the one that was received by this Jewish kid, is that being Jewish isn't always easy, but it's always worth the effort. And I think that if there was one thing that came through loud and clear to us, that was it. The community was never any bigger than about 200 people. The two congregations that I remember were the Bethel that I grew up at, which was founded right after World War II. Guys came back from service and wanted something a little bit different for them and for their growing families. The other congregation I remember was my grandparents' synagogue, which was known as the Brick Shul. It did have a real name, which is Ahavas Shalom, which means lovers of peace. Of course, I didn't know that it had a real name, I think, until I was a teenager, because we just called it the Brick Shul, because, of course, it was built of brick. My family had a grocery store. The store was opened up in 1942, June 10th, 1942, as a matter of fact. My father graduated from high school on June 8th, 1942. On June 9th, they took inventory, and on June 10th, the store opened up. It was during World War II. Dad was not able to serve in the armed forces, and so he worked for his parents. The workforce was my grandparents, John and Sophia Alpert, both of whom had come up in retail grocery business, especially in the fruit and vegetable department, and then my father, their younger son. My parents were married in 1953. My mother is originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where her family settled in 1913. We were a very, very close family. My parents had two children, me and my younger brother, Dick, who was just 2 years younger than I am, and he lives with his family in Milwaukee. Because it was a family business, there was not much of a delineation between home and business. When I was born, we lived in the flat above Alpert's Food Market, which was our family business. And then when I was a baby, we moved 2 blocks away to the upper flat in the duplex that my grandparents owned. We lived in that apartment until 1966, when we moved to the home that my parents built, in which my mother still resides. There was never any thought of my getting any kind of a part-time job. I worked at Alpert's Food Market, so did my brother. We started out stocking shelves, and then we learned to read the scale, so that meant that we could work in the produce department, or we could even be behind the meat counter. We learned how to make change. We learned how to bag groceries. And I suppose, like all kids, I viewed it as some sort of an intrusion on whatever I assumed my free time was supposed to be. In reality, if I have any skills at all, talking to people, making conversation, enjoying people's company, it's because I did grow up behind the front counter of a grocery store and was always taught that when customers are there, you need to make them feel welcome, and so we did. My grandparents continued to reside in their home 2 blocks away from Alpert's Food Market. As a matter of fact, when I was a little girl, Grandma and Grandpa had the same telephone number that the store did. So if we happened to be at their home on a weekday for whatever reason and the store was open, we never answered the phone if it rang, because obviously it was supposed to be for the store. If I'm thinking very hard about my family, it would not be uncommon for me to pick up my phone here in my office at Bethel and answer Alpert's Food Market, because it was just so ingrained into me. And it's kind of a nice thing to carry with me after all this time. We lived on the other side of town. The synagogues were on the north side, and Alpert's Food Market and my grandparents' house was on the south side. Now, when you're talking a community of 45,000 people, the difference between the north side and the south side is about 7 minutes by car. But when one is North High School and one is South High School, there is a difference. When I was 11 and we moved to the house that my parents built, of course they built their home on the north side because they wanted to be where the Jewish kids were. And again, it's all very relative. Being where the Jewish kids were meant that I wasn't the only Jewish girl in my high school class. It meant that I was one of three. There were 5 Jewish kids in my high school class, and we all belonged. We'd all gone to Hebrew school together. We were all at each other's bar and bat mitzvahs, and we all belonged to BBYO together, which was our youth group. There was no question of there being United Synagogue Youth or anything else. We were lucky that there were enough of us to have one youth group. There wasn't even enough for BBG and AZA. We were just all together. And as my dad had been president of AZA Chapter 15 when he was in high school, I was the president of Sheboygan BBYO Chapter number 15 when I was in high school, and my brother was the president of the chapter as well. And I guess the message again was that in a small community, if you don't jump in and do it, if you don't participate in it, if you don't make it happen, it might not happen. Everyone is precious, everyone is important, and everyone is needed to help make things happen. In a smaller community, getting a minion together can be a very serious thing. When there was a yahrzeit in the family, my father or my grandfather would make sure that there would be enough people there so that they could say Kaddish, because if you didn't do that, there might not be. And by the same token, then, they were always on call for somebody else. We used to tease and say that you could never talk about anybody in our community because either you were related, which was a pretty good guess, or you were landslike, which meant you came from the same village in Europe, or you came over on the boat together. The ties were very, very strong. And to this day, people who came from Sheboygan and grew up in the Jewish community there feel that we may have been smaller, but we were given quite a bit, and the community really made it possible for us to have those things. In terms of my own identity, first of all, there was my family who made it clear that this was important to us. Because we were a very small family retail establishment, the store's success really depended on everybody. My grandfather was the main person in the fruit and vegetable department. I remember my father most clearly behind the meat counter. My grandmother and then later my mother would be up at the cash register, but again, everybody could do anything that was necessary. I wasn't too good at carrying out 50-pound bags of charcoal, but on the other hand, I did know how to push a 2-wheel cart, and all somebody had to do was to help me balance it, and I could do quite well. I learned to read a scale by standing on a milk crate. So again, anything was possible, and usually was. It was a real feeling of being needed, and things were very important. We were not closed on Friday night or on Saturday. That was something that came to my life later on. But the high holidays were really the focal point of our year as a family. The store was closed. There was no question about that. And it was very clearly Yontif. When I was a little girl, we all gathered at my great-grandfather's home. My father's maternal grandfather, his wife, my great-grandmother, had passed away. As a matter of fact, I am named for her. And my grandmother, their older daughter, would go and make the holiday, all the meals and everything else at her home. And we'd come home from school, Erev Rosh Hashanah, rush to get changed and dressed, and then we'd dash over to Zeta's home, where we would wait at the house with my mother and my grandmother and my aunts. The men would go to shul, and then they would come back. And I remember very, very distinctly, it was fall, and it was chilly outside, so they'd come in, and they were chilly, and they smelled from outside, and it was clear, and it was crisp, and everybody was dressed up, and the house smelled wonderful, and it was Yontif, and there was just kind of this glow. And I'm sure that everybody didn't get along with everybody, and I'm sure that everything wasn't always wonderful and happy, but I remember it as being this very special time that was to be cherished. And then everybody would come inside and wish everyone a Happy New Year. The Yontif candles would be lit. We'd all gather at the table, and then the meal would begin with Kiddush, and then with Motzi, and then we'd have this Yontif meal, and then we'd clean up, and everyone would go home, and then we'd gather the next morning at the synagogue. And there was never any question about not being there. We never wanted to be anyplace else. When my brother and I were older, when we were in high school, it was unthinkable that we would go to school on those days. It was never a question. First of all, as far as I was concerned, any normal kid who didn't willingly take a day off of school, probably there was a problem there. And why would I have chosen not to be with my family? Why would I have chosen to separate myself from this? There was always something that spoke to me about holiday celebrations, about families being together, about the way the davening sounded in shul. I don't remember anyone ever saying to me, "This is important. This is something you should do." It just felt right, and consequently, it was always something that I wanted to incorporate into my own life. When I started Hebrew school, I was in third grade, and I remember very distinctly my father picking me up from Hebrew school and then stopping over to see my great-grandfather. And I remember sitting in the kitchen at the table with him and reciting the brachot that I had learned that day in school and what they were for. And I remember, of course, that he pronounced the words a little bit differently than I did, but it was clear that what I was doing and what I was saying was pleasing him. And that's also a very, very nice thing to remember. When I was 13, I won a scholarship to enable me to go to Camp Ramah in Wisconsin. And at a time when Jewish education for boys and girls was pretty much a given, there was no question that I was going to Hebrew school, and there was no question but that I was going to have a bat mitzvah. There was still this sense, perhaps, that maybe it wasn't as important. Not in my family, and not from my rabbi. I attribute part of this to the fact that Zayda, my father's maternal grandfather, didn't have sons of his own. He had daughters. And so it was very clear from the outset that if you don't teach the girls, nobody's going to learn anything. And that was passed down to me very, very clearly. And then the rabbi of my own congregation, Rabbi Nathan Barak, had daughters. And we were taught everything that everybody else was. What the boys learned, we learned. What I was able to do on my bat mitzvah day, perhaps, was a little bit different than what my brother actually did. I chanted the parts of the service, for instance, that you did not need a minyan for. I didn't know this until later on. On the other hand, I was able to take an aliyah. I did chant the Haftarah with the brachot, which I found out later on was really quite a concession for a gentleman who had been educated in an Orthodox yeshiva, but yet this man felt so strongly that it was important for everyone in his school and in his community to learn and to do, that was very, very crucial. And I think about that often in terms of my own directions in life, that I may have been wandering down a path, but I had very loving and wise mentors who guided me on those paths. And if it had not been for Rabbi Barak, I probably would not have gone to Camp Ramah. And that was really when everything opened up for me. I didn't know how bad my background was, or perhaps how limited my background was, but I also knew that I wanted to do something about it. Hearing the Hebrew language spoken around me was like hearing a beautiful song that I just didn't know the words. So I made it my business to learn the words. And I'm still struggling with Hebrew all these many years later, but when I look at where I started and I look at where I am now, I've made great progress, although I'm certainly not done learning yet. And for that matter, I hope I'm never done learning. I always loved the way it sounded, I always loved the way it looked, and I always loved the way it felt when I was in the synagogue and people were participating together. And it was something that I wanted to do. I stayed at Camp Ramah as a camper, thanks to my community, thanks to my congregation, and most of all thanks to my parents who encouraged me to go ahead and to do this. And I worked at Camp Ramah as a staff member all through college, and as a matter of fact, that was where I met my husband. I was not going to return before my senior year of college, and the new director of Camp Ramah, who has now just finished his 27th year as the director, called me to say that he had heard nice things about me, and he was disappointed to see that my name was not on the list. Could he convince me to come back? I said, well, I'd been a bunk counselor for a number of years, and I really wanted to do something else. And he said, well, that was fine. They needed an assistant in the program department at camp, which oversaw the activity program for, at that point, I think 390 campers. And might I be interested in that? I thought, well, okay, that sounds reasonable. Who would I be working with? I said. He said, well, you might know him. His name is Paul Drazen. I said, oh, I do know him. We have mutual friends, and he is really a funny guy. I think we probably could work together. And we did. And just to cut to the chase, we were married 2 years later. We were married on September 4th, 1977, in my home congregation at Bethel in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. We had friends from all over the country who were able to join us at the wedding, and I think that they were astounded to find that there was a synagogue in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. There was a synagogue in Sheboygan, Wisconsin that turned out really delicious kosher food. My parents had engaged a band from Milwaukee that had played at a lot of Jewish weddings, and we really had a lovely, lovely evening. The only fly in the ointment was that it was, as people from southeastern Wisconsin know, there's nothing quite so hot and humid as a September day in Wisconsin when there's no breeze. And it would have been fine if the air conditioning in the synagogue hadn't broken. The band leader asked me during the reception if it was all right if the guys in the band took their coats off. I thought that would be just fine. But we really had a wonderful evening, and God willing, we will celebrate our 25th anniversary this coming September. I finished my undergraduate degree at the University of Wisconsin and knew that if I was going to do anything with my life, I wanted to aim in a Jewish direction. So I took my bachelor's degree in secondary education with a concentration in United States history from the University of Wisconsin, and I applied to the graduate school at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and I was accepted there, and I started my studies at JTS in September of 1976. I lived in the brand new opened Matilda Schechter Residence Hall, 2 blocks away from JTS. Matilda Schechter, that had been a Columbia Residence Hall that was rebuilt with contributions from sisterhood ladies all over the United States. Of course, my mother was the Torah Fund chairman for our sisterhood in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. So the residence hall was something I'd been hearing about for years, and I always thought that it was pretty cool that I got to be one of the first people to live there. And when I started at JTS, now they call them prerequisites. Then they called them deficiencies, and I was really very, very deficient. I would have matched my education in the areas of social studies, English, anything else, and certainly education with anyone on campus. But in terms of my Jewish education, I really had never gone beyond a very rudimentary Hebrew school. But I wanted to learn, and so I really started from the beginning. And it wasn't always easy. What I do remember, though, was that it spoke to me. It was a struggle, but it was a struggle that was very, very much worth having. And it paid off. 3 years later, on the same day that Paul was ordained as a rabbi, I received my master's degree in Jewish education from JTS. And it really was a wonderful day. My parents were there, Paul's mother was there, our siblings were there, and it really was a culmination of so many years and so many different paths that had brought us together. And from there, we moved to Minneapolis, where Paul was an assistant rabbi at Bethel Synagogue in Minneapolis. As you can hear, we've kind of gone from Bethel to Bethel to Bethel, which I think is kind of the way it's supposed to be. It's all meant to be, I think. When we were living in Minneapolis, I taught at the congregation's preschool. I also taught at the Minneapolis Talmud Torah. And then our daughter Gila was born in November of 1980. And I kind of semi-retired at that point in time and only taught 1 day a week. I was still finding out what it was that I wanted to do and who I wanted to be when I grew up. all that I knew was that I had this beautiful little blue-eyed baby girl who needed me, and whose smile kind of filled up my heart. It still does. In 1982, it was time for us to move on. Paul had completed 3 years as an assistant rabbi, and we needed a place to go. We had heard that there was an opening here in Omaha, and both of us wanted to stay in the Midwest. And when Paul finally got a call to come and interview here, it was like someone had heard a prayer. My parents came to Minneapolis to take care of Gila, who was 18 months old at the time. And Paul and I flew here on a Friday. We stayed at George and Toby Kagan's apartment on Underwood Avenue. And then the interview began. I've never been quite so nervous as I was that weekend because I really didn't want to mess anything up for Paul. I figured if I just smiled at everyone that I met, I couldn't do too badly. And I wanted to be here. Everything did work out, and we moved here in July of 1982. We lived in an apartment across from Bethel Synagogue on 49th and Farnham. We lived in a first-floor apartment, 2 bedrooms, and put our stuff into storage while we were looking for a house. And that was the beginning of our life in Omaha. I taught at the Bethel Talmud Torah High School when I first came here. Then we moved into our own home. Yoni, our son, was born in February of 1984. My mother-in-law, Paul's mother, became ill in the spring of 1983, and her illness was a very difficult thing for us. We weren't there, and it was very tough on Paul not being there. It was tough on me watching him be so sad and knowing that there was very little I could do about it. I still had my parents. My father's mother was still living. It was difficult to know how to respond. My mother-in-law died in January of 1984, and it was tough. It was tough on all of us. I was 8 months pregnant with our son. I couldn't go with Paul to the funeral in Detroit, which was very, very tough. The congregation wasn't quite sure how to respond. How do you take care of a rabbi when he's in mourning? But people rallied. People made sure that Gila and I were taken care of here. There were meals for us. People kept on calling to make sure we were okay. And then Yoni's birth on February 23rd, 1984 was really a wonderful thing. First of all, because we had a beautiful, healthy son. Of course, Gila made it very clear that he was really hers. I was just his mother, but she was really his favorite person. And he is named for my mother-in-law, Yona Nahum. And the Drazen family of 4, it's difficult to remember we didn't arrive in Omaha that way because Yoni was born really so soon after we got here. But we are a very close family, perhaps because we're just the 2 children, perhaps because of our family situation. We depend on each other quite a bit. I found a letter that Yoni had written to Gila in her first summer at Camp Ramah. He had asked me to put it in with my letter. And the note said that, you know, I'm doing this at day camp and I'm doing that at day camp, and Shabbat is really boring without you with just Ima and Abba. And I was delighted because sometime after I'm gone, my kids will still have each other. They're very close. They have a very positive, nurturing brother-sister, teasing, elbowing, wonderful, wonderful relationship. And I really feel if I've done anything, if we've done anything positive, we've given our children a best friend in life, which is a marvelous thing. Well, what else should we talk about?
I'd like to hear you tell me a little more about your mother and father.
Okay. My dad, Arthur Alpert, was born on March 31st, 1924 in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Dad was 6 feet tall and was probably the most positive, friendly, upbeat person anyone would ever want to meet. He had a good word to say for anybody. He could make conversation with anybody. And we used to tease him all the time because he would strike up conversations with perfect strangers, and they'd just be having a wonderful time chit-chatting, and everything would be great. Dad went to work at Albert's Food Market for his parents immediately after graduation from high school, and worked there until the store closed in 1982. Dad seemed to me to be the kind of person who could do just about anything. He was tall, he was good looking, he didn't go beyond high school, but yet always was interested in people and things and world events, and his own interest in history and world politics got passed along to me. He died in December 1988, and his presence is still very much with me, and I miss him very, very much. But by the same token, his memory, when you talk about someone's memory being for a blessing, his really is, because if he left us any kind of a legacy, it's a legacy of laughter, which is really a delightful way to remember somebody. He took great delight in my children, Gila and Yoni. Yoni really latched on to Dad and just adored him. I'm trying to remember how old he could have been. Mother and Dad were visiting us, and then they left to go home, and Yoni woke up from his nap, and he wandered around the house after he woke up, looking from room to room, kind of mopey and weepy. And I picked him up, and I held him, and he was fine. He wasn't sick. He didn't need changing. He wasn't hungry. And finally, I looked at him, I said, "Yoni, do you miss Grandpa?" And he, "Yeah." So we talked about the fact that Nana and Grandpa were on the way back home again, and we would call Grandpa, and we would talk to him on the telephone. And Yoni was 4 when my father passed away. A number of years after that, we were driving someplace, and Yoni said he knew what he wanted to be when he grew up. I said, "You do? What is that?" He said, "I want to be a comedian." I said, "Comedian? That's great, but why?" He said, "Because I want to be like Grandpa. I want to make people laugh." And I thought to myself, wow, if that's what he remembers about Grandpa, that's a very nice thing to take along. My mother, God bless her, still lives in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Mother was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and yes, I'm going to tell them how old you are. Mother was born on February 14th, 1930. My grandparents, Harry and Gertie Melman, met in Milwaukee and were married there. Mother was their first child. Mother was premature. Mother had pneumonia when she was an infant. Mother was kind of a sickly child who, thank God, grew up into being a very healthy girl. Mother she's very quick. She's very smart. She's very loving. She's very nurturing. She knows how to take care of people. She thinks she doesn't know how to talk to people, but she absolutely does. And really has become one of the mainstays of this small Jewish community that still exists in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. She's been the president of the sisterhood there since 1988. She's on the synagogue board and takes a real interest in life and what's going on around her and the people around her, and always was interested in more, always interested in people. She went to work as the executive secretary at the Jewish Home for the Aged in Milwaukee when she was 18, and stayed on until she was married in 1953, and has a good head for words and a good head for numbers, and knows how to talk to people and knows how to work with people. And if there's anything that I know about maintaining a Jewish home and making people comfortable in my home, it's because I've learned that from my mother. And I think that's also a wonderful legacy that I'm hopefully able to share with my own children. Because the home that I grew up in and the family that raised me was so consciously and positively Jewish, it was something that was very important for me then to be able to pass on and share with my own children. And the fact that my children seem to genuinely enjoy Shabbat at home with the family, enjoying holidays at home with the family. Gila has not been home for the high holidays for the past 2 years because she's had a high holiday pulpit of her own at the Hillel Foundation in the University of Texas in Austin. But still comes home to be with us for Simchat Torah because she said this is home and this is Bethel and this is where I need to be. Yoni is going off to college next year. It's a very strange thought for me to think that I will have no children at home. Holidays and Shabbat were not something I did for the kids. They were something that I did for me, that Paul and I did together, because it's part of our lives. But the kids are such an integral part of our family life and what goes on, and I guess how the Drazen family does things, that it's strange to think that now Yoni will just be coming home on visits as Gila does.
Do you have a message you'd like to leave for your children? Just between you and the children.
Oh my, there's a couple things. First of all, there's nothing that's more important than your family, because when it comes right down to it, that's who you are, that's what you are. And even when things seem the most difficult, it's still worth pushing. It's still worth trying to make things happen. Being Jewish isn't always easy. Being different isn't always easy. But making it happen is the important piece of it, and how you feel about yourself and what you're able to do in terms of helping your family, helping other people, and your community, your congregation, and eventually you help the world when you just do what you need to do, and you help to make the world a better place.